Call the meeting of the regular meeting of the Amherst City Council to order at 7 p.m. on Monday, March 25th, 2018. Roll call.
Mr. Janik?
Here.
Mr. Van Turen?
Here.
Mr. Dembinski?
Here.
Mr. Cowger?
Here.
Mr. Benarski? Mr. Nahorn?
Present.
Mr. Miller?
Present.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to excuse Mr. Winarski. He has a letter on file.
Mr. Cowger.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to excuse Mr. Winarski. He has a letter on file. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 6-0. Will you please stand with the prayer led by Chaplain Nahorn and pledge to the flag led by Sergeant at Arms Dembinski.
Please join me in bowing your heads. Gracious God, during this month of March, it is always comforting to hear the words of an Irish blessing. May your troubles be less and your blessings be more, and nothing but happiness come through your door. And now let the words of our mouths and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your vision. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll go to item 4, the consent agenda.
Minutes of the regular council meeting held March 12, 2018. Minutes of the ordinance committee meeting held March 19, 2018. Minutes of the finance committee meeting held March 19, 2018. Minutes of the building and lands committee meeting held March 19, 2018.
Mr. Van Turen.
Move to accept the consent agenda.
Mr. Miller.
Second, please.
There's a motion and a second to accept the consent agenda as read. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 6-0. We'll go to item 5 on the agenda, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items on the agenda. Is there anyone here wishing to speak on any of the items on the agenda? Seeing no one wishing to speak at this time, we will go to item 6 on the agenda, ordinances and resolutions, first reading. Item 6A, please.
An ordinance amending Chapter 351 of the Amherst Codified Ordinances by amending Sections 35105 and 35199 and repealing Sections 35151 and 351.21 and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Cowger.
Make a motion to suspend council rules so that item A may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Janik.
Second.
There's a Mr. Miller.
Thank you. Suspension of council rules for this?
Yes, I mean, they're basically unable to enforce this law without it, so the police department's asked to pass this along as quickly as possible.
This is a handicap law, correct?
This is the handicap parking spaces.
Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Vote is 6-0. Rules are suspended. Mr. Cowger.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Nahorn.
Second.
Motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0.
It will be ordinance 01813.
Item 6B, please.
An ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a contract to purchase a 2018 CAT mini hydraulic excavator for the water and sewer departments through the Ohio State Cooperative Purchasing Program and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this one actually has a bit of a financial attachment to it because they'd like to start working on this sooner rather than later. And if we do pass this on suspension of council rules, then they'll be able to purchase this and not have to rent out a piece of equipment. So I would move to suspend council rules that item 6B be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Cowger.
Second.
Motion and a second to suspend council rules. Mr. Miller.
Once again, this is in our budget, and the use will be immediate,
Absolutely.
and we are doing a state cooperative purchasing program. So with all those three reasons, I will accept the suspension and support this with suspension. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Vote is 6-0. The rule is suspended. It requires 3 readings. Mr. Janik.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Kuren?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Vote is 6-0. Item is adopted.
It will be ordinance 01814.
Item 6C.
An ordinance authorizing the city of Amherst, Ohio to enter a revocable license agreement with Wide Open West Cleveland LLC, WOW, to install necessary equipment for the use of internet, cable, and phone services on city-owned property and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Mayor.
You'll notice I put a map in front of you all showing the position of this piece of land that WOW is wanting to use. They've worked with our electric department and our superintendent of utilities to mark this spot, so this is a favorable spot for the city. And this is probably the most important piece of the puzzle for the new cable company. They can't do anything without this being installed. So they'd like to get this done as soon as possible.
So this is critical path to the WOW.
This is the most critical. They're moving along very well with their cable installations. I see them all over the street. We've had some questions. They're doing very good working with residents to make sure they're cleaning up their job sites. But this is the most critical part of the project.
Thank you. Mr. Janik.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 6C can be passed in its first reading.
Mr. Van Troen.
Second that.
There's a motion and a second to suspend the rule requiring 3 readings, so this can be passed on the first reading. Mr. Miller.
Need for suspension, please? Or does the,
This is a critical path item, right?
This is something that'll benefit all the residents. It's the most important part. They won't get this project up and running in time without this piece of property that this piece of equipment will be put on.
there were some questions regarding liability and legality.
It's in, of course, the city carries, some insurance and
We-
but the contract, go ahead if you like.
No, I was gonna say,
Contract, it really protects the city.
Yeah, our contract requires the appropriate amounts of insurance that we feel the city's protected.
And it actually even escalates according to the times. A lot of times these requirements says $1 million or $2 million, and it's that for perpetuity. Law director put in some sort of formula so this grows with the needs.
And just to bring back to our awareness, what was the contract that we wrote with them? What are we getting off of that, of their installation?
Well, the state laws has the franchise fee. That's 5% of their gross proceeds for their cable operations. We have a pole attachment agreement, which it's almost $10 a pole for their attachments. And then we also had the right-of-way use agreement, which gave them some requirements when they're working within the right-of-way, and there was a permit fee. It was 1% of their total construction dollars for the permit. And this license agreement has a $1,500 fee that also has an escalation clause that goes up. But I think they're going to be coming back to us with something more permanent, more like a lease or an easement. But this was the quickest path to get them to have a piece of equipment installed.
So this, so the contract for this particular pad to be placed on the city property is $1,500 per year?
Yes.
All right. And that's in addition to the right-of-way fees,
Yes.
the pole fees. Do you have an estimate of what kind of revenue, and if you don't mind me asking, I know it's just a slight deviation from the ordinance request, but where will this go? All these fees, and is this
General
going?
fund.
General fund? So it's not gonna be line item in any of the?
Correct.
Okay. Alrighty, thank you, Mr. Mayor, thank you, Mr. Cora. Thank you, Madam
Is that
President.
complete? Mr. Dembinski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. They have been going through, they're actually in a current development in my yard this morning. I actually kind of agree with Mr. Miller that I do question if this really does need the suspension of council rules, only because, yes, it hurries the project along, but we had talked before about following only doing suspension of council rules when there was a real reason to do it. This is one of the things I do question if we really need to do this, or is it really going to delay the project if we wait until the second or third reading. It already does have the emergency. I don't believe they're actually there waiting to build the thing yet. I question if it does need the suspension of council rules at this point.
Mr. Mayor?
I guess I would just speak a little bit through our talks, to trying to talk them in here. You know, I somewhat assured them that we would help items like this move along as quickly as possible. I don't see what suspension and not suspending rules. There's no other place for this. It's not in the way. This is a revocable license. We can tell them to remove this. I mean, they're not going to like to hear this right now, but this revocable license, we can tell them to remove this thing anytime we want to, you know, with a certain amount of days. This has the protections in it necessary. I think where you'll want to suspend rules, or not suspend rules later, is when we get to the either lease or easement agreement. That one you'll want to consider more, but this gets them that piece of equipment. And honestly, if they didn't think they were going to get this here quickly, they probably would have started on another project. So I'm counting on this to happen quickly.
Mr. Law Director, you wanted to.
Right, and I think we need to just have a quick discussion as to two different things. There's an emergency portion, which means it would go into immediate effect. That can be passed on the first, second, or third readings. The suspension of rules is suspending the rules of 3 readings itself. That doesn't need any discussion of why it's an emergency. The emergency clause itself is a discussion, you know, why is this an emergency and why should it go into immediate effect? Actually, the law, which is interesting, the law doesn't require council to even discuss it on the floor of council. The law requires that the ordinance itself discuss why there's an emergency. And the law can't simply say, for the preservation of peace, health, safety, welfare of its citizens, it needs to add something else. And what's been added into this, it says the emergency being the need to enter in such an agreement in order that the licensee can begin with providing needed services to the residents of the city. If council believes and the council passes an ordinance under the theory that we need this to provide needed services to the residents of the city, meaning communication services, technological services, you know, basically the services that WOW's been providing via its cable resources, that's enough for a court of competent jurisdiction to say we're not going to interfere with this councilmatic action. Council decided what this emergency was. It's in the actual ordinance itself. So that's what the discussion should be. And I think you're trying to have that discussion. So this
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually with the emergency, I wasn't necessarily questioning that. I guess it's just, we had said before, suspension of council rules, when you pair that with an emergency, should perhaps be the exception, not the norm. What the actual issue of where this is placed on the land and the lease, and I'm actually all fine with that. I guess it's just a procedural thing I'm questioning.
And we're not, just a point of order, we're not suspending council rules, plural, we're suspending one rule. That's the vote. It's one rule.
And this, just to talk about this piece of equipment, it is what's going to power up. This is where their hub is. They can't start testing lines. I mean, they cannot really, even if they get all this stuff in the ground, they can't do anything without this piece of equipment. And I don't know what their planning process is, but it's their most expensive part of the project also, I doubt. I don't know what their procedures are, but it's going to sure help get that new cable network up and running if we pass this as quickly as possible.
Any
Thank you.
other?
I'm good,
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Madam President. Do we have any services that we'll be licensing from them, or when this goes live?
Not at first. We've WOW wasn't here when we negotiated to get somebody to provide our network ring and our technology services, so there's a year or 2 years, then they'll be in the picture. I'm sure. I'm sure they would have liked to have been, but they weren't ready enough to put a bid on that.
In addition to that, I would agree with Mr. Dominski on this, that we can always suspend in the second reading. When you pair suspension and emergency both, it needs to be something that is maybe a safety issue to do something like that. So I would be voting against suspension, and I'll consider it on the second reading. Thank you.
Mr. Janik.
I just want to say there's been some residents that I've talked to locally where the only provider in our area, or one of the only providers, has increased the rates $20, $30, $40 within the last month or two. And this provider said after April 1st, you must go completely digital on your TVs in your home, which means you'll no longer be able to use coaxial cable. So there's, myself and several other residents around me who are pretty upset about what a local cable company has done to us, and we welcome the opportunity to secure a different service. So as soon as we can get this service in place, I think it's going to provide kind of a competition between that other entity or that other group, which I think is healthy and good for the citizens. Thank you.
Mr. Cowger.
We've already passed ordinance allowing them to attach to the poles. This is a step. If we don't pass this, then they wouldn't get the property to put their station in. Any of the work that they have done to attach lines to the pole for the ordinance that we passed already, I would question if they couldn't come back and hit the city with, you're standing in our way, you collected money from us attaching to your poles, and, now you're denying the area for us to get this. In conjunction with that, I know that there are a lot of residents in the city that are not happy with the current cable company. And this is an opportunity to provide a service to the residents in the city to alleviate some of the problems that they're having with their current monopoly, pretty much, of the cable. So I will be supporting the suspension and passing of this ordinance.
Thank you. Mr. Nahorn.
Yes, thank you. I concur with Mr. Cowger, and after having closely reviewed the ordinance and the documents provided by our administration, thank you. We, I believe, as a council should act as the least bit of a stumbling block to a new service that is going to be very much a positive coming into town. So the quickly we can get moving on this will be the best, I think, choice for our residents. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Law Director,
No, not yet.
Okay, not yet. Okay. Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Madam President. So I do question if we need this. I hadn't and have not perhaps decided on which way I will vote on the suspension of council rules. I do want to say I respectfully disagree with Mr. Cowger in that at this point in time, we are not denying WOW the ability to build this. We're expecting WOW to follow the same standard that they would for any other period of law. If we got to the point where we said at third reading, we are not going to pass this, then perhaps WOW would need to be able to come back and say, hey, what's going on? But I don't think anybody coming to the city should be expected to have things passed through on emergency with the suspension of council rules. The standard should be to follow the proper procedure as laid out in our laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Madam President. I would agree, and I think that Councilman Dominski astutely put it in such a way that I would agree with him as well, that this is not about not wanting WOW in here. It's not about putting up stumbling blocks. And then I would question, and I would ask our Treasurer, have you received, according to Mr. Cowger, we have collected fees from WOW for these pole attachments. Have you received checks for fees from WOW? 'Cause
I couldn't tell you offhand, you know, you'd have to give me a little bit of time in order to get that. There's so many different streams of income that come into the city.
I can answer that. He wouldn't receive any checks for the pole attachments yet. The contract states after 1 year of being attached on the pole, there's an inventory done. Then they pay for the prior year's worth of attachments. So they are just now attaching the poles, so there would be no fee for the pole attachments yet.
Okay, so that was misspoke on the fact that
If
we're
this gets
receiving
passed,
fees.
And the other urgency might be, this contract goes April to April as it's written. So I would assume this would have to be in effect to get our $1,500 payment by the 1st of April. And I'm just gonna, I don't like to beg much, but this was a long standing negotiations, a lot of meetings to get these people here in town. It's really amazing service that they're willing to provide for all of our residents. This contract is probably the most restrictive of any contract I think I've dealt with within other entities that's been before you. Again, this is a revocable license. We could, tomorrow after you guys vote this in, if for some reason you decide to give them 180 days notice and tell them to remove it. There are protections there. You might not think 2 weeks means much, but in a business like this and that company, they're already advertising. I went out on a limb and gave my word we would move this along as quickly as we could because I did see the benefits for our neighbors. So I know you said you're against it. I really hope you would consider and let this pass. There are ways to protect the city if this ends up being a bad decision, which I don't think it is. This is a win for everybody.
Thank you. Mr. Cowger?
Yes, I believe, if I misspoke, I'm sorry, but I believe I stated that we have passed an ordinance where we have authorized to collect the fees for the pole attachments. I did not say that we had fees coming in currently, but that we have accepted or authorized them to attach to the poles, which a fee was provided for that. That is all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further comments or questions?
Just one maybe
Yes,
other
Mr.
comment.
Mayor.
This might not be the only location they could put this in the city. I mean, they could go to a resident, put this in a residential neighborhood if somebody allowed them to license it within their own property where it would be allowed by code. This is a very out-of-the-way place. It's not going to bother anybody. It's by our utility building. This is the best place in the city for this thing to go. I mean, I honestly think if we delay, they'll be looking for other options. And it could end up in somebody's neighborhood in the public right-of-way, less mind you. They have the right to use our public right-of-ways.
Any further comments or questions? I would counsel those members of council to very seriously consider this vote. April 1 is when the changes are going to go into effect with the current cable provider, and if we delay this by a couple of weeks, we may be sending a very strong message that to the alternate provider, that may be a message that we don't want to send. Roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0. Mr. Cowger?
Move to adopt.
Mr. Janik?
Second?
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0.
Will be ordinance 01815.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll go to item 7 on the agenda. 7A, ordinances and resolutions, second reading, item 7A.
An ordinance rezoning a parcel of land from R1 to C2 located at the intersection of Cooper Foster Park Road and North Main Street, having an area of 4.23 acres and identified as Lorraine County Auditor Permanent Parcel Number 0500021103097.
Mr. Dembinski.
I'll move to send item 7A on to the third reading.
Thank you. Mr. Cowger.
Second.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second to send item 7A on to the second reading. Comments or questions?
Third reading.
Third reading, I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Cowger.
No.
Oh, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Madam President. Just quickly, I want to thank the entities involved with speaking on this issue and before us in committee and during the first reading. I restate my firm interest in making sure that this is a win-win solution when we put this in. And I say we as in we team with the group that is looking to develop here from an R1 after it's being rezoned from R1 to C2, that we look at traffic issues. And I personally had spoken to you. You had reaffirmed your commitment to work with the city in regards to traffic study. And I hope that you and your group remain cognizant of the issues there and try to help be part of the solution. With that, I yield back to the floor. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0. Item 7A is sent on to the third reading. We'll go to item 8, ordinances and resolutions, third reading. Item 8A.
An ordinance to make appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures of the City of Amherst, State of Ohio, during the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2018, repealing all ordinances in conflict herewith and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Miller.
Move to adopt, please.
Mr. Cowger.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0. Item 8A is adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01816.
Go to item 9 on the agenda, miscellaneous and acknowledgement of the public. Is there anyone here tonight who wishes to speak on any item? Seeing no one wishing to speak, we will go to item 10, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules. Mrs. Savinsky.
I have two items, Madam Chairman. To Building and Lands, A1820, an ordinance to approve the subdivision plat and final improvements plans for the preserve at Quarry Lake Subdivision Number 3, and also to Building and Lands, A1821, an ordinance authorizing the Community Improvement Corporation to expropriate city-owned vacant property located on Terra Lane. And those are the two items I have.
Thank you. Finance, Mr. Cowger.
No items at this time. Please cancel.
Building and Lands, Mr. Van Truen.
Two items. Excuse me, I'm sorry. First, A1821, an ordinance to approve the subdivision plat and final improvement plans for Preserve at Quarry Lake Subdivision Number 3. Second,
They were on the same paper.
they're on the same paper.
Yeah.
Second, no, that was A1820. The second is A1821, an ordinance authorizing the Community Improvement Corporation to expropriate city-owned vacant property located on Terra Lane.
Thank you. Is that complete?
That is complete.
Thank you. Street, April 2nd,
April 2nd would be great.
7 o'clock?
7 o'clock.
Okay, very good. Streets, Mr. Van Truen.
Nothing at this time.
Community Development, Mr. Miller.
No items, please cancel.
Executive, Mr. Miller.
No items, please cancel.
Ordinance, Mr. Dembinski.
No items at this time, Madam President, please cancel.
Utilities, Mr. Janik.
No items, Madam Chair, please cancel.
Recycle, Mr. Nahorn.
Please keep recycling.
Technology, Mr. Dembinski.
No items at this time, Madam President, please cancel.
Police and Fire, Mr. Miller.
No items.
Annexation, Mr. Van Truen.
No items this time, please cancel.
Thank you. We'll go to item 11, reports of the administration. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Petek?
I have no reports at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Ramsey?
Just a reminder about income tax, the City of Amherst income tax returns and requests for an extension are due April 17th. And we do have extended office hours, Saturday the 14th from 9 a.m. to noon, Monday the 16th from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m., and Tuesday the 17th from 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's complete.
Thank you. Mr. Pecora?
No report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries?
No report, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to address council on that last issue with suspension of rules. I really appreciate you, a couple of you that reconsidered and really dug deep to think about that. I just want to assure you, I promise, I'll be watching that project. I'll make sure it's done. I'll make sure they adhere to the rules and ordinances and codes, and it'll be done tastefully. I think you did a good thing for the city of Amherst today. I really appreciate that. So, end of report.
Thank you. Mr. Calgar.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the reports of the administration.
Thank you. Mr. Dembinski.
Second?
There's a motion and a second to accept the reports of the administration. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 6-0. Mr. Miller.
Move to adjourn, please.
Mr. Calgar.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. We are adjourned with a vote of 6-0 at 7:32. Thank you.